Good afternoon, everyone. This is a special moment every fall or sometimes in the spring when we recognize the DeSouza Award winner. And it's my distinct privilege to introduce the terms of reference and how this award came to be and who DeSouza was. It was almost 29 years ago to this week when I first met Russ DeSouza, and our first interaction was actually the very first meeting of the Unidata Users Committee when it was created in 1989. There were about 7 or 8 of us who got recruited to serve on the users committee, and we had our first meeting, and Russ was my co-committee member at that time. He was a very kind and warm person, and we hit it off immediately. Had lots of interesting conversations over beer and other things during the course of that particular meeting. As almost all of you know, since the founding of Unidata, the program has benefited from the commitment of numerous individuals in the Unidata community, without whose contributions Unidata would not be what it is today. And Russ DeSouza was one such individual who actually made human contributions to the program in terms of bringing visibility to the program, bringing new ideas to the discussion, and making Unidata kind of a shining data facility in the atmospheric sciences. He got, as I said, first involved with Unidata in 1989 through his service on the Unidata Users Committee. And then he, literally after a year and a half, he was asked to join the policy committee because he brought such wisdom, and thoughtfulness to his contributions and comments. He went on to serve on the Unidata policy committee. And a year later, he actually volunteered his department at Millersville University to be the program that would decide where the geostationary, floater image was going to be located. So he actually had several students as part of their education activity to decide the region of interest for that day's weather, and then he would send the centroid or the coordinates of the central location to Unidata staff, who would then extract the appropriate image from the GOES product and transmit it through the Unidata Wisconsin channel to the broad community. These were the days when bandwidth was very limited, so not all of the data could be transmitted, and one had to make a decision on where to put that floater on that particular day. And they did a fantastic job, he and his students, in providing that information. The same concept was then extended a few years later when WSR-88D systems were installed, and what radar sites from the NextRad network would be providing that information to the community. He unfortunately had to step down from the policy committee in the summer of 1995 when he was diagnosed with melanoma, and he died 2 years later, succumbing to the cruel cancer that had metastasized through his body. He retired from Millersville just a few months before he passed away, and was quite involved in Unidata even after he had stepped down from the faculty until the very, very end. So after his passing, the Unidata Users Committee and the Program Center discussed how to honor him and for his many great contributions to the program. And the Russell L. DeSouza Award was instituted. The terms of reference for the award are, and I'm just going to read it. This award honors individuals whose energy, expertise, and active involvement enable the Unidata program to better serve geoscience. Honorees personify Unidata's ideal of a community that shares data, software, and ideas through computing and networking technologies. And we, live up to these credo, and to this very day. And there have been numerous individuals who have been honored with this award since the year 2000. And it's great to see one of my dear friends and somebody who has contributed immensely to the Unidata Program Center activities, as well as to the broader community, Steve Lazarus, recognized. I'm going to ask Kevin Gobert to do the formal recognition and the citation and the handing over of the plaque, or a fake plaque, as they say.
Thank you, Mohan.
You didn't hear that from me.
So we fell a little bit behind, so we don't exactly have the real plaque here. But we have Dr. Steven Lazarus with us today, being honored with the Russell L. DeSouza Award for his 8 years of extensive service to the Unidata community, including being one of the organizers of the 2012 Triennial Workshop, and the endless amount of hours that he has put in and dedicated to both his students and to Unidata to make sure that all of our services are available to everybody in a more accessible way, especially through the use of IDV. And so congratulations. Awesome. Steven.
Yeah.
This is not Oscars.
That's right. Speaking of the Oscars. I'll take this. Speaking of the Oscars, all right, I guess if you turn this on, hopefully everybody can hear me. I guess this is more for the guys taping in the back. I may be an honoree, but I am also honored, so thank you very much, Mohan, for the kind words. Kevin, thank you also. It's awesome. And great to be up here talking to you guys today. So I have to admit right from the outset that no puns or films were harmed in the making of this presentation, although if you pay attention, you may catch a few that may entertain along the way. And also the title is really sort of borrowed from an Atlantic magazine article that fantastic article in April, I think, actually, about the future of scientific publication. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit today, especially as it relates to notebooks, right? So everybody certainly knows what that is. So without further ado, well, you don't have to be that knowledgeable about cinema, but que sera, sera, whether you're Doris Day or Nostradamus, doesn't really matter, or this guy, basically. Everybody in the room should definitely, I promised Inc. and I have a lot of pretty pictures. So attempts to predict the future have a long and inglorious history, just in case you didn't know that. And I'm not supposed to stand in front of this, but so I'll try not to do that, but I am a nervous speaker. So anyway, again, so you're forewarned, basically, to put a filter on this, most definitely. So the future is ours to see, to keep with that Doris Day theme for a second here. Those who'd seen War Games, and Matthew Broderick might recommend Shall We Play a Game up there, basically. Some really crude text scrolling across the screen of an ancient cinema. And then, of course, The Simpsons were great at sort of mocking technology, especially as it came to computers. My favorite one, of course, is that middle image with Homer looking for the any key on the keyboard. And I grew up on this. And then, of course, the backdrop on this figure certainly is no accident. It's Tom Cruise, basically, Minority Report. And that movie was a bit prescient, in my opinion, basically, because a number of things have come to fruition from that film, that dystopic film, I would say, definitely, that pictures this 2054 sort of surreal world, basically, of a not-so-distant future. Actually, it was, believe it or not, now I know I'm old. That's part of the reason probably why I'm being recognized today. But nonetheless, that movie was made in 2002, which is pretty amazing. So just in case you think you're young. Anyway, what did we see then? We saw driverless cars, which are still somewhat challenged, as we know. Personalized ads, a little creepy, a little eerie. And we're sort of see these things pop up, interestingly enough, on forums like Facebook, knowing what you bought and things like that. Voice-controlled, voice-activated technology, certainly Siri is alive and rocking on your iPhone and other devices. Facial and optical recognition has come to fruition. Gesture-based computing, which is interesting as well. Predictive policing, which is really what this movie was about, this sort of pre-crime, pre-cog world, basically, where you were trying to head off crime, murders specifically, basically, before they happened. Now, that is creepy, but nothing's creepier than, well, actually, let me take a little segue here. As sort of, essentially, technology evolves, I just wanted to start light, and so does our language. So, oh my gosh, it's hard to keep up with not only technology, but it's also hard to keep up with the language that flows with it. And so folks that might be familiar with some of the verbiage, I had picked a couple of terms I thought were interesting. Nomophobia. Anybody know what? I mean, I like when I went with my students, I mean, it's no sense I stand up here and do all the talking. All right, audience, your turn. Nomophobia. Anybody want to guess? I'll tell you what it's not. It's not this guy. It's not spelled right, for one thing. The other thing, of course, is that, just a warning, this guy's going to make another appearance later in the talk. So not this guy, all right, yeah, you know, no one's going to humor me. It's actually the fear of losing your mobile device. My life is on my mobile device, I can guarantee you. So I probably qualify for that one. Certainly that's an issue. This one, I practiced this one, and then I'm really frightened to actually try to pronounce it again. Logizomomechanophobia, maybe, possibly. Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
Fear of understanding machines.
So I like the way you pieced that together, right? Right, and you know, that's fear is obvious, the obvious part of that one, right? And mechano, right? Mechanics, and then logizo or logi. Yeah, well, okay. So the fear of computers. So close enough, right? So anyway, I like it, and that's how it's pieced together. Anyway. And talk about fear, nothing replaces this one. I still have nightmares about Stanley Kubrick's 1968 film, 2001, basically. Space Odyssey. Hal, of course, with that eerie voice, talking to Dave, basically, about self-preservation. So anyway, you're probably at this point wondering when I'm going to get to the real stuff. I promise it's coming, but I couldn't resist. So I go back a second. So as technology evolves, so does our language, the other point I wanted to make, and perhaps so does our paranoia. So anyway, not that anybody in the room is paranoid, but nonetheless, I think it's an interesting thought. So, all right. So what happens in cyberspace doesn't necessarily stay there. And, you know, this problem of technology and where we're going to be in years as we look forward is not just intrinsic to our geoscience community. Clearly, it transcends that. And there are all sorts of issues that are being discussed if you start looking around the internets. And one of the things, of course, is this artificial general intelligence I ran across. Molecular assembling. I mean, it's pretty amazing, right? And these people, just like geosciences, are confronted with the same kind of problems of visualization. How do you communicate the science to folks? So these are areas that basically share the same kind of challenges that we do for various reasons, whether you're doing education, research, or all of the above. Nanotechnology, hive minds, some of these I didn't even know about, so I ran across looking for them for this presentation. Intelligence, augmentation, it gets creepier, wait. Some people could really probably use the intelligence augmentation part. No, just kidding. Radical life extension, that's me being snarky. I have to sneak a few in. And also this sort of propulsion engines, especially powerful ones. I like this one. I like the qualification, useful quantum computers, right? So I like it. I can relate to that. And then I really love this one, mind uploads, complete human brain emulations. You know, that's kind of interesting, but some of these are more distant than others in terms of when they may come to fruition, but they are interesting to think about. I threw this last one on the cloud. obviously omnipresent, so I didn't want to leave it off the list, and it sort of encapsulates all sorts of things on this list. So anyway, that's the big picture, and I pulled a lot of these off of Gizmodo, so I want to take credit. I think I cite most things at the bottom of the slides just to be safe. So all right. So we all know there are immutable invariant laws when it comes to computation. Obviously, Moore's law, and in terms of the density of integrated circuits, essentially, and basically computations as far as that's concerned. And so I'm not going to spend much time on this. Then we all know Murphy's law as well. But do you guys know about Cole's law? Okay. This is actually a pivot point, a transition in the presentation. So hold on, Rich. Bear with me. All right. So at this point, you're probably wondering whether I'm going to actually get to the point of this, right? So this is where it begins in terms of getting a little more serious. And this is actually, again, as cited here from the Atlantic's article in April. Essentially, this idea basically is a scientific publication obsolete. And in theory, if I click on this, there's no sound, but there's flames. So this is dramatic. Anyway, so this sort of starts the more serious side of my talk. I lifted pieces what I thought were kind of relevant. I love the text here. This is the author, and he pretty much leads in. I'll go ahead and read it. I know everybody can read it anyway. But he says, the more sophisticated science becomes, the harder it is to communicate results. Papers today are longer than ever and full of jargon and symbols. None of mine are like this, though. They depend on chains of computer programs that generate data and clean up data and plot data and run statistical models on these data. Yes. These programs tend to be both so sloppily written and so central to the results that it's contributed to a replication crisis. Or put another way, a failure of the paper to perform its most basic task, to report what you've actually discovered clearly enough that someone else can discover it for themselves. This whole idea of reproducibility is a little bit disconcerting these days. So that's my lead-in. Okay, so it's not all serious. So is there a method to the space madness, or the madness in general, when it comes to public, scientific publications? So these things evolve at the speed of software. We've seen some of these kind of this kind of verbiage even within Unidata, and some of the things that we do here. The skill most in demand, I would say, is a facility with programming languages and data science packages. And again, I've taken this article and I'm distilling it for you guys. So it's several pages long, and I'm just picking out highlights that I thought were important, trying to put it in my words. So I thought these are interesting comments made throughout that we could all relate to. Some are obvious. Yet the basic means, this is the best part, yet the basic means of communicating results, scientific results specifically, haven't changed for 400 years. That's an OMG moment, if you ask me. But they haven't. I guess that's a glass half empty or a half full perspective, or what I was telling Toma earlier, maybe a glass that's twice as big as it should be. Whatever one you pick in that list, ultimately, clearly, there's probably some room for improvement, definitely. And so, but it's worked fairly well. We're not here by accident, right? We have made some progress, I think. Anyway, and then papers obviously may be available online, but there's still text and pictures on a page for the most part. Let me qualify that. Some folks are making progress. So as we press on, again, we all know Gutenberg and the press, basically, although clearly when you start looking at sort of a history of the invention of the modern press, it predates Gutenberg in the Bible. Turns out the Chinese were making little blocks, essentially, and doing some neat mass publication that predates his work, basically. But that's really not the point. I digress for a second. The point of this one is just basically it took forever basically to go from making this press and actually using it in a functional sort of way that distributed knowledge over large bodies of population. And that's my point. So, this is a quote from Brett Victor, basically a former Apple researcher who developed the iPad prototype, basically. There's this huge period, basically, where this thing didn't get used. So, it's sort of, and then I have a comment here, basically, makes you kind of think, and it wouldn't probably take long for a bunch of us to sit around and sort of meditate on this for a little bit. And, and my comment here, basically, is you have to ask whether or not, as we move forward, whether we've actually made the best use of the stuff that we currently have as we keep shooting forward in time. So, anyway, something to think about, clearly. So, Victor basically, this iPad prototype, when he worked for Apple, then decided, well, let's ask a great question. Let's take a step back and say, well, and this is what they discuss in the Atlantic article. It's like, what would you get if you actually designed a scientific paper from scratch today? Fair enough, right? With the advent of notebooks and visualization tools becoming ubiquitous and quite useful compared to 10, 15 years ago, and it was kind of neat. So they chose a particular article, which is kind of interesting. They took one out of Nature, no surprise there, and the authors were Duncan. Some of you guys may recognize these if you read the literature. This one's apparently just a very famous article, Collective Dynamics of Small World Networks, written by Duncan J. Watts and Stephen H. Strogatz. And Strogatz is a famous mathematician. He's written some pretty well-known books, from what I understand. And they decided this would be the article because it was written with such clarity, ostensibly. This was their best choice. Better yet, though, and some of my articles have this kind of citation rate as well. I think I'm going to... Yeah, and Victor liked that one. All right, 37,000 citations. It's just phenomenal, right? I mean, every scientist sort of dreams that, Yeah, anyway. Okay, so the sort of idea here is that software is a dynamic medium. Paper isn't, right? So don't lose that thought for a second in case you have. And I have to agree, it does seem a bit peculiar that... research is still pretty much shared on paper only. And like I said, it's kind of worked, but we probably could do better. And so let's talk about that a little bit. And for this particular article and sort of recasting this, for this particular exercise and recasting this Nature article, basically, you can imagine with the sort of technology we have today where they might have gone with this. And so they developed this sort of interactive text spliced with data, spliced with anime. They went through the whole text, basically, and brought all the figures to life. All right, which is really neat. Not just brought them to life in a way where you're sort of stuck in a lab. I'm sort of winging it here. Where you're stuck in a chemistry lab or a physics lab where everything's prescribed to work out perfectly for you, or else. They've got things you can tweak and parameters you can change, and so there's a learning component to these modules, as they should be from a scientific perspective or an educational one. So I don't know the details of exactly. I just looked at this as a spirograph. Essentially, they're connecting nodes on this figure to look at the complexity of biological systems, but you get my point. It was kind of a neat exercise, so I'll leave it at that. And I don't want to leave Russ Rue out of this because it turns out that, I had this conversation with him at Unidata 8 years ago, probably, of making, this idea of dynamic publications, making things come to life. So this is something not new, and other folks have had these ideas. I thought he was crazy then. No, just kidding. So, computational notebook, I'm speaking to the choir here, sort of preaching to the choir when it comes to these things, clearly. And so what can I say? The brainchild, from my understanding, according to this article and a little bit of looking around, was Theodore Gray, and he was actually inspired by an old Apple code editor. Oh my God, I'm old enough to appreciate the days when we were happy to have debuggers where you could just stop a code somewhere and figure out, print something out. That was exciting. So anyway, you can really appreciate this. And so even the Apple code editor, apparently, basically, you could highlight part of the code and run just that piece. Holy smokes, that is a great pedagogical tool, you can imagine, basically, and a great scientific tool all wrapped in one. Clearly, I have benefited from this type of, I love it. It's a great way to rock, it's a great way to roll, without a doubt. And obviously, what's its design? Its design is, if you're a programmer, especially somebody like me who grew up on Fortran, right, 77, and that's come a long way, even into an interactive exercise that helps the user come to a more intimate understanding of their data. What else more? What more can you ask for in that situation, right? I like this quote, and it's from that article. To write a paper in a notebook is to reveal your results and methods at the same time. It's a nice sort of synopsis of what you're up to. So I have to introduce some personal stuff in here. So I'm using notebooks. I never thought, you asked me 10 years ago, no way, right? So I'm using a Jupyter notebook. What am I showing you there, basically? I'm showing you Tropical Storm Harvey, an anemic one south of Puerto Rico. And then its track, the best track data goes across it. It's what is it? It's the IR clean channel. So it goes 1613, basically, really nice enhanced image that I'm working with. And all those little dots on there that are on top of what coldest cloud tops are actually lightning from the GLD 360 data sets. Oh my great, this is awesome, right? I'm doing this on the fly. It's from Vaisala, their data. Basically, I'm working with some physicists, trying to better understand which of these lightning events, essentially, that are showing up on this image is responsible for the gigantic jet. There was a couple of dozen of them associated with this highly sheared, very anemic tropical storm Harvey south of Puerto Rico. I'm sort of thinking about this in a perspective now. I'm on the verge of writing this up. How would I do this if I wanted to take this notebook, right, and integrate it into my publication? I never really ever thought about this, but now I'm kind of doing it, which is interesting. So it's a challenge. And there's overhead to doing these kind of things, right? It takes effort. Even if you've got stuff, a lot of it's just hodgepodge. It's a kludge, right? My coding, even within the notebook environment. Perspective is everything. I tell my students that, and we sort of spoon feed them a bunch of stuff. And getting perspective on life and getting perspective on the world is so important, right? And so this idea of algebra of thought is many centuries old. Basically, it emanates from Leibniz. Yes, he's the founder of this nice little integral differentiation formula, basically. Some of you may be familiar with. That's really not the point, so ignore it. And again, it's the only formula I harmed in the making of this presentation, in addition to the puns and the films. And so he had this idea, basically, of this language, this universal language, to communicate, basically, science to people, science and math. So, this has been thought about for centuries. That's my point. It's a point that comes out in the article pretty clearly, I thought. And an exact quote from the article again, because I really like to lift stuff that I cannot say any better and just put them in quotes. Actually, this is from a Wolfram blog post. He's certainly familiar with, Mathematica and notebooks. And he said that as practitioners in many fields become more literate with computation, they'll vastly expand the range of what's discoverable, right? I highlighted in red because it's certainly one of these sort of buzzwords that we're all bouncing around these days, and it's a relevant one without a doubt, in my opinion. So here we are, open source science. I've heard all sorts of references to basically open science, open source science. So there's different references to the same idea. And this idea of notebooks or as computational essays, which I kind of like as well. They're telling a story, right? Just like a speaker gets up and sort of threads an idea across or topics across to their students or an audience. It's the same kind of thing. It's a delivery, it's showmanship, it's thought, it's all sorts of neat stuff. So another quote, obviously all scientific communication, all technical papers that involve any sort of data or mathematics or modeling or graphs or plots or anything like that obviously don't belong on paper. And that was this is a duh moment, sorry, according to Mr. Gray anyway. That was just completely obvious as far back as 1990s. And he's probably right. Some people obviously had this epiphany a long time ago. That does happen. And again, with millions of scientists worldwide producing incremental contributions, the only way to have them really add up to anything significant is if we can reliably build on this. Basically, the premise of science, right? The sort of foundation of science, ultimately. And most of science, honestly, is incremental. If you've ever read Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, of course, there are folks like Einstein and other and Kepler, Copernicus. There are revolutions in science, but most of it's incremental, let's face it, right? Anyway, this idea of that's what ultimately having science presented as computation essays can actually achieve, is this incremental and a very systematic way for the most part. There's chaos embedded in this as well, so don't get me wrong, but it's certainly a nice way to move incrementally forward. Again, some other snarky comments about Common Cause and computational socialism. Basically, this is actually from the founder of the IPython, Interactive Python, which is now Jupyter, of course. And all these quotes are attributable to him. He said that if science is to be an open enterprise, the tools that are used to it should be open themselves. It's really great, actually, to run across people out in the real world that are not entirely driven by money, that actually have ethics and principles and visions. It's so awesome. And so it's refreshing. And so I appreciate it. It's a deep breath moment, let me tell you. Anyway, commercial software whose source code or data you were legally prohibited from reading, I love it, is antithetical to the idea of science. No kidding. And this is I didn't pick this out randomly. This is something that really worries me when we had discussions today, basically, about the future of the cloud. What happens in the cloud doesn't stay in the cloud, right? But it costs money to pull it out of the cloud. And these are real issues, right? And so they're kind of related to this idea of being antithetical to science, especially for the little guys. And there's lots of little guys in this room. And I feel passionately about that, if you can't tell. All right. So anyway, so building tools that are are there to make things work better for scientists. Tools, and this is kind of Unidata, right? Right, Ethan? And that tools that made it easier to manage data sets and draw plots, and that encourage a more open style. Right? It's really great. It's a nice revolution happening in our field, whether we like it or not. It's not just the fact that the software is free, but it's nice, clearly. So free is the right price, if you ask me. But it's that anyone can inspect the code, modify it in the open. You can see where this is going. This is all about open source. It's awesome, right? This is not MATLAB, right? This is open source. This is more like R. This is Python, right? This is where we're going. The notebooks. It's great. Anyway, so. Again, no films were harmed, but great film nonetheless, basically. So more about the IPython notebook. It's my point of this one, really, ultimately, if you're not a visual person and you like the verbiage better, which I could understand, but nonetheless, it's not an accident, basically, that we are where we are today. I don't believe in accidents. Not mostly. I do believe in randomness, though. It's a growing library of all sorts of extra features: the image processing, creating music, building AIs, analyzing. This is just part of this, right? Analyzing language, graphing data sets. So like tools like Mathematica, Wolfram's Mathematica is more powerful computationally. Even R, Python, this is kind of really aimed at, has all these tools, basically, and all these available libraries that are just really, it's really great, and there's no end in sight as the sort of open source legacy lives on, I guess I would say. And by a community of open source this is what I always like this one. Anybody ever get that unqueasy feeling, basically, that it's almost too good to be true? The word free, it's no such thing as a free lunch, right, guys? Seriously, somebody's got to pay for it somewhere along the line, really. And so, unless I told you he was coming back. You've got gnomes working for you on the side, basically, doing all this work for free. Kind of amazing. Anyway, it's back to sort of computational socialism in that sense, right? Anyway, I'm being silly, sorry. Ultimately, any of these programming language communities that rely on this sort of kind of model really depend on these kind of positive feedback loops to succeed. So anyway, whether you're a gnome or not. All righty. Clever is as clever gets. Well, these people are not dumb, they're brilliant. And so they're building these notebooks as simple web pages. I underline web pages because when you think, I was talking to Kevin Tile about this last year, about where he thought things were going. The web browser, web interface is so friendly to basically these notebooks. It's pretty amazing. And you can just imagine where we're going to be heading as far as that's concerned. So I really wanted to make a point. So, in groups like these, when the Borg, I call them the Borg, when the Googles and the Apples out there basically are developing open source code anyway and publishing this, it gets rolled. It's clever. It gets rolled right into IPython, or now Jupyter Notebook. Basically, this is, for the most part, at least a lot of this is shared software, which is awesome. And I found this as kind of interesting. This came up today. So, you start going to see what kind of cool, I started playing around with this, loading this into my eyes. It's just great. So the folks that basically were looking at gravitational waves have a very nice set of basically Jupyter Notebook, basically, out there for looking at lots. It's really, really nice. It's no longer supported according to their website, but wow, they have a lot of stuff on there to generate images, to play around with things. And that they haven't taken that off, which is really cool. So they published in a regular journal, but they also supplemented all that. I see people doing this now. They're not the only ones. So they put it all in a journal article, the classic PDF journal article with the hypertext to references, whatever. Nothing all that sexy, but clearly this is great, right? This sort of augmentation of their work, basically, with the Jupyter Notebook material, really fantastic. So really cool. And the commercial world's there. Tomer, I see this as a Pivotal Weather or Tropical Tidbits. I've got links down below. They're doing the same kind of things. And so, oh my God, these websites are great. This is a 138-hour forecast, basically from a few days ago, with something looming offshore the Carolinas. Go flow, I guess. But that's not my point. You just point and click on this, and boom, guess what? SharpEye. I chunked it. The rest of the other panels are there from SharpEye are there. Anywhere on that map you click, and this is, of course, I couldn't resist clicking in the middle of the worm core storm, and definitely warm. But I mean, that's great. So people are catching on. This is clearly just what I would say is just the tip of the iceberg. Clearly, commercial folks are certainly on top of things, and obviously there are other things out there. In all fairness, and a plug for Unidata, clearly that were not developed for the cloud necessarily or web browsers, but that are being incorporated into that sort of framework. You asked me as a researcher basically where things are going as delivery, as interactive tools. Wow, the browser is a powerful tool, and a lot of people know how to use it, not just us. All right. So as I sort of wind down here, we have to, I always think of journals online, not very sexy, is it? But we certainly might reimagine where we're heading with what they mean by journals online in that sense. So I started looking at what folks were researching over the years. This is 2004. People looking at basically, this has been going on in the literature probably longer than this, clearly. So there's one article. PLOS has had several articles, something on Tellurium notebooks, basically. And still, the ultimate goal, no matter where you're pulling this information from, these articles from, is all about the essence of science and its reproducibility, which is becoming, again, a real issue for a lot of us. So it's not trivial, and I have run into my problems trying to reproduce other people's work and getting in a little bit of a spat with them over it in the process, having people publish stuff out from under me as I started asking questions, errata and things like that, which is a very fascinating experience. Anyway, I'm never going to do it again. One notebook science. I like the open notebook science as emerging epistemic culture within the open science movement, which is kind of interesting article there. And then another PLOS article on digital open science tools, reproducible and transparent research. People who are I like people who are transparent. Why shouldn't research be transparent? It's great way to live your life, right? And again, there's the AMS Journals Online logo, right? What does that really mean, right? Journals Online. Wow, it's a PDF. Wow, that's exciting. So no offense to AMS. It's time to move on. And as I say, it's time to move on. There's nothing like inertia. I'm guilty too, folks. It's hard to sort of, I like, John, your comments today basically of just, uncertainty about making commitments to new software that may or may not have any staying power. So these are certainly legit issues. And so this is my opinion. Sometimes things move too fast. Others move too slow. And that goes for all sorts of issues, right? So, will it be that computational notebooks only sort of take hold if there's financial backing? I don't really get this feeling. I'm just throwing this out there. Whether it's, sort of the, big corporations involved in funding these things, although, and you should vet this, don't trust me. I've said nothing about the delivery mechanisms and people sharing all this code, right, on GitHub. I mean, we just could go on, keep this talk short, so we could, because I'm in the sort of way of drinking, and then you don't really want to get in the way of that, definitely, by any stretch of the imagination. But nonetheless, actually, I think from what I've read about over at least 1.3 million notebooks at least publicly hosted on GitHub, but I bet there's more than that. It doesn't seem like enough now. So it may be old news, not fake news, but old news. And then it's also hard to sort of sell the scientific community on a piece of commercial software data. I'm one. Good luck with that one. I'm not a big fan. Definitely not. So no way. And so are we on the cusp of a sea change? Well, I don't know. Let's think about this, right? I think it's probably going to be a while before these notebooks replace PDFs. I mean, like I said, there's overhead involved, right, in addition. Clearly, though, it has to be incentivized properly by funding agencies. Otherwise, it's never going to happen, right? And so, obviously, that's an issue, an ongoing issue. There just seems that's sort of maybe belongs on the inertia slide and not the sea change slide. I don't know, right? And so ultimately, controlled journals basically require, just part of, we're getting to the point, right, where, Unidata has invested some effort basically in data management, right? All the agencies are asking, what are you going to do with your data, right? And so clearly, unless this goes on with the delivery mechanism as well, then we're sort of stuck in the same pattern we've been for 400 years, I guess, technically speaking. And then, this is never going to go away, right? This idea that, my God, some data sets are so precious, right, that you're not likely to let go of them anytime soon, right? You spend a whole career on them. I've never been lucky enough to get a hold of one, but if you know of one, let me know. Yeah, right. Okay, so dynamic tools and linking up research and data. I'm getting close to sort of wrapping this up here, and this is we as the sort of Unidata team, or basically other folks involved in data visualization and data science. How do we make things? How do we best make things visible and accessible? Not just our results, but our derived, this value-added data that I'm involved in projects that are taking data, massaging it, and doing stuff with it, and spitting other things out that other people can use. All people do that commercially. We do it as scientists, right? And so how do we get this stuff out there? Yeah, I know. This is me speaking off the top of my head. I just left it in here. I'm not sure I meant to do that, but there it is. I know there are all sorts of delivery mechanisms. You ever try to find data, though? Find data sets through these servers are still tough. Trying to sort of mine it's just very difficult. So I'm going to talk to that point in a second. And then, of course, how much data is too much interactive data? And what do I even mean by that as a sort of user perspective, right? So here comes the shameless plugs. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm up here. I get a few of these, and so this is a paper we're just putting out it'll coming out in Estuarine, Coastal, and Shelf Science, basically in November. Working with a PhD student of mine, and we've calibrated and developed a parameterization that essentially, ultimately takes ensemble output from the Jeffs, essentially wind forecasts, puts them into a a setup parameterization. We live right next to a water body called the Indian River Lagoon. It sloshes with the wind. It's wind-driven. And so the Weather Service needs this information for protection of loss of property and life. Flooding goes on along the lagoon, yada, yada, yada. But here's the paper coming out, and it's completely divorced. I admit it's completely divorced. In a second, there's one more component to this paper. There's another paper that just came out in a monthly weather review, another PhD student of mine, basically. Those winds, you can't just shove the winds in that model because they're biased and uncalibrated, right? So you have to deal with that issue as well. Anyway, not really the point. My point really is, here's the product. This is being published 4 times a day on the web. You can get to it on GitHub, basically. So as Jeff cycles 4 times a day, this is cycling 4 times a day. The y-axis is just the setup between 2 points, one on the northern end of the lagoon, one on the southern end of the lagoon. And you can see the ensemble envelope on this thing, the median, the mean, and the blue, and the red. You can see, not much going on. They're in centimeters, so it's not a big high impact period. This is recent data. But there's no connection with my work. Our work, excuse me, right? It's still divorced. It's not really great. I'm guilty. That's all. So, starting to think about how to better integrate that. And then how much data is too much data? So I've got a master's student, basically, that's set up. This is wave parameterization over the same region. There's a bunch of folks in our area that are interested in all the erosion that's going on along the Indian River Lagoon. So we're taking basically wind fields and running basically hydrodynamic models and running parameterizations, and we're trying to get an idea of a climatology of wave heights over an extended period. Yada, yada, yada. The bottom line is ultimately, we've got over a million data points, 5 years of data, 6 times a day. And wouldn't it be really cool if you could just click on a point, basically, on a spread and pull a spreadsheet up, basically, or we saw some indication today, basically. Rich, I think that you guys were playing around with this, basically using some of the Python software libraries, and just pull out a time series, basically, at a given one of those million points, basically, of the significant wave heights, basically, at that location for that period of data that we have. So somebody, basically, who's interested in coastal erosion or estuary science, basically, who want to actually put an oyster mat in a location that's not bombarded by waves too much, basically in a more sheltered. This is useful information that goes way beyond what we do as meteorologists, right? So, but I mean, do you squirrel this away in a thread server somewhere, and is it just going to die a lonely death? in that environment, and if it worries me, right? This is stuff people need to, and how do you get to it easily, right? All right, and then we were playing around with some of this public version of it's the same data basically that you saw in that ensemble, but actually this is a hodograph, and it's a setup hodograph. So the colors, it's a regular hodograph, but the colors on there, instead of being, looking at a true wind hodograph here, you're actually just looking at basically winds that are either blowing from northwest to southeast or southeast to northwest. So you have centimeters here, so much as a meter change basically is a pretty high impact event sort of going on in this image. And what you do is you spray on here the 21 ensembles from the Jeffs basically on here in the space of the hodograph to get an idea if you're a weather service employee, whatever, to go ahead and try to make a smart forecast for what's going to happen basically to waves and setup along the lagoon. But better yet, what I like about this kind of software, it's dynamic, right? I can't show you this here. I wasn't brave enough actually to go there and do that today. But it takes advantage of basically the dynamic sort of like you were doing today, Rich. Basically, you start moving around and you're starting to get information, numbers, and IDV does this too, right? You can point and click on it, and it gives you the values, and so it's kind of a nice way to think about science and data. So anyway. What else is going on? So ResearchGate, I looked. So which online tools do you use for open science, right? So I was trying to find out what kind of conversations people are having about this. And of course, I showed you some literature, but like what on forums like ResearchGate, this was useless. It was a 2014 discussion. All the links were dead already, basically, and probably passé for that matter. Nonetheless, basically, so nothing really amounted much to this as far as that was concerned. And I didn't get to check the links. There were dozens and dozens on this commercial site, basically, that claimed to connect researchers, basically. And they had this nice little cartoon, which I did like, in terms of these digital tools for researchers, right? And so it's a very simple way to sort of essentially view these sort of components of using data and science and research. So kind of nice. All right, so the next to last, I guess the penultimate slide, I suppose, so to speak, is the axis of praxis. So I stole this as well. I'm not sure how many original ideas I've ever had in my entire life, and occasionally when I think I have one, I found out that it's not. So nonetheless, basically, I like this quote, basically, this developer, right, of IPython, he said that nobody in their sane mind challenges the fact that the practice of scientific research is under major upheaval. This is written in 2013. I pulled this image, actually. I was looking for the sort of motivation for the Jupiter logo because I like to learn something when I do these presentations. And I like to basically wrap almost this up. This is almost a wrap-up kind of statement. The logo was an abstracted version of Galileo's original drawings of the moons of Jupiter, which is kind of neat. And I like his quote here. Galileo couldn't go anywhere to buy a telescope. Basically, he had to build his own. So this guy certainly has an ego, but he also has a vision, without a doubt. And actually, when I pulled the image, it actually came from UCAR. So they had this online, basically, which is kind of cool. So deep breath as I make it to my final slide. It's not meant to be sad. This is my dad. He just died this summer. And kind of sad, 85 years old or young. He is sitting there in his nursing home, in which I moved him in basically the last 6 weeks of his life. So I think I can do this without crying. But what's my point? My point is to share with you guys that here's an old man, right? He's on an iPad that we bought him. He's streaming using Sling TV, a Marlins game. He's never used an iPad in his life. And we ended up basically having a decent end of his life for 6 weeks, learning basically something entirely new. This is encouraging, right? And then basically we were able to FaceTime with him, which he'd never been able to do. He didn't even know how to use a cell phone. So this was pretty amazing, right, when you think about it. I think it's awesome. It's inspiring. I'd like to leave you guys on that note. And again, one last reference to literature and the movies. Thank you. Okay.
All right, questions for Steven?
I'm wondering if you could speak to archival issues. So if I publish in Monthly Weather Review this month, I'm pretty confident 50 years from now, my grandchildren could read that paper if they really wanted to. I'm not as confident that they'll be able to run my Jupyter notebook 50 years from now.
That's definitely a legitimate question. I probably should defer to somebody out here as far as an answer to that. My opinion would be, we've talked about that with Unidata, right? Sort of giving some longevity, adding DOIs not only to published articles, basically, but published data sets, software. So I think that as long as those don't disappear, which they're not supposed to, my understanding is, that might be one way to ensure, but it'd have to be built in, right? So in addition to the processes that I mentioned here about changing the culture of publication, you're going to have to change, you have to ensure this. I like the question, actually. You have to ensure folks like us that it has going to have some staying power, which I like. Yeah, it's a good question.
I think I can answer that question. There'll be gnomes out there who will write a simulator for a Jupyter notebook.
Excellent.
Yeah, I have a question.
That's the snarky response.
What about peer review? It's useful for separating the wheat from the chaff.
Is that a statement or a question?
Well, what about peer review and all of this that you've talked about? Anybody can go out there and put out, some sort of notebook that's got junk in it.
Yeah, and that's right. So, in the best of all possible, again, there's junk everywhere, even in science. Thank goodness, what I do like about the scientific process of publication is that junk doesn't usually stay around very long, which is, you can't say that about other realms of our culture. And so I'm optimistic that, for the most part, this would not be a standing issue. There's always curious eyes out there that are going to run the notebooks, play around with them, ask questions, just like they do with articles, right? I make contact with writers of articles that I said, for the life of me, I can't figure this out. Am I missing something? Or is this an error in your equation? I've done this several times, and usually they're pretty receptive. I think on the flip side, for transparency, which is a word that came up several times in the presentation, that the reviewer, is a reviewer responsible if there's 10 figures and 10 notebook supplements to go along with it? That seems to be a daunting task for a review process. But on the flip side, it might certainly make it easier to test some ideas out along the way in the paper to make sure things are right? Certainly easier than me actually trying to fish the data up myself and play with it a little bit just to test, just to check my sanity on it, right? Which I've done before in reviews. So I don't know, it's kind of a mixed bag. I probably didn't answer your question. I hope I didn't evade it completely, though, either. If I did, we can talk about it over drinks later.
So a question that's a little bit poking the bear, but you talk about science progress being fast and slow. Do you think that having an open approach like this could also lead to a slower science if people are developing, say, data sets of their own, and then they retard the publication process so that they don't have to share the data in order not to end up in the situation where their notebook is actually sharing the data that they don't want to share yet?
Right. That sounds like the law of unintended consequences. Right? You be careful what you ask for. There's always sort of these, it is possible. Yeah, definitely, yeah. I agree. Nothing else to add. Yes.
So I'm curious, this is poking the bear too, but
Uh-oh.
How deep does the open
out.
science rabbit hole go? I would submit a question to you.
Oh,
What's the difference between Go16 and MATLAB?
Difference between, which question?
You mentioned in your talk about MATLAB being an issue because you can't go into the source code and you can't debug all this. Why isn't Go16 the same problem? Can you go into Go16's source code?
Yeah, of course, right? Yes, that seems like a loaded question.
And this is
you really want me to answer
right?
that question, or is it a rhetorical question?
But
I'm trying to feel my audience out here, right?
But where's
I'm
the
not a
rabbit
bear.
hole stop? I know, but where's your rabbit hole stop?
It doesn't, and they never stop, right?
So-
there are always issues related to all of this stuff, right? There's no panacea here, right? Clearly, I'm not arguing with you, really.
Right, I'm not either, but
yeah, so
we're academics, right?
But you're trying to back me into a corner here. Is that what's going on?
Every sensor, right? There's limitations to every sensor.
That's right. Like I said, I'm not a bear, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express once.
It seems like what this needs is a reputational system to go along with it. So you can't go into the Go-16 code, yes, but Lockheed Martin has a proven track record, and they have a good reputation for their instrumentation, except for Go-17.
Daryl. So I'm not being totally fair, right? So I had colleagues in the physics department that were, when I was giving a presentation on the gigantic jets, were flummoxed and just surprised a bit that I couldn't go into the radar data, right? And get into they asked me about what about the raw data? So, well, there's level 2 and there's level 3, and that's about it. So these are questions people are asking, right? So in all fairness, I like your question, and there's always a hornet's nest out there, lurking just behind the door, above the door, in a crack somewhere, a crevasse. I don't have any answers for you, honestly. Life doesn't have that many answers. Yeah.
Hey, Steve. So I think a lot of early career scientists and even programmers in general understand the need for open source. But the reality is the currency of the academic, right, is the citation. Yeah. And this idea of the inertial powers against you, like AMS, it's if you're going to publish, right, you want to publish in a journal that has impact factor, et cetera, when in reality, you're judged on T&P for citations and impact of your research. And so there's really not an incentive yet, whether it be from institutions or from AMS or whatever the respective journal is in your field to really push open source. So how can we get past that? Because I don't see any movement of the needle in the last 10 years in regards to forcing people outside of, just somebody going to stand up and say, I'm not doing anything except for open source. It's going to take editors and journals to do that in institutions. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts on how you get past the inertia problem.
Yeah, that's I don't have answers for. I thought as I put this thing together, I'm like, I knew this question was. Figured you asked it, but I knew this was going to come up. Not sure I have any answers for that one. I think clearly there has to be a paradigm shift. Excuse the pun, as far as this goes, and I do notice that the younger generation has a different philosophy for the most part. But again, the incentivization is an issue, right? So that's a tough one to overcome. I think it should
be at the institutional level or at the funding, like National Science Foundation.
I think it has to be at a higher level to be effective. I think just like these data management plans, I sort of hinted at that a little bit. I think that if it's not at it's like in any policies, right? Some things can be local, but something pollution, right? It's a global issue, right? So I think a hierarchy, it has to be top down. Some things have to be top down. My inclination is to say basically it has to be at funding agency levels. And it's, again, in 10 years, things haven't changed probably much in 400, really. Some people, I like your comment, some people are taking the initiative, right, to do these, like the folks who are doing the gravitational stuff, decided to publish a notebook along with their published, their peer review lit. But again, that's a lot of extra effort. And you're not getting rewarded for that.
So I think an interesting development through the AMS, I know Gary Lackman has just recently commented on this on the MAP listserv about publishing a short synopsis, essentially, of your research work alongside your published paper within AMS. And so I'm wondering if that's an initial step that, in another way, we need to be better communicators of our science and our data in a way, and that something that could follow on from this is this idea of sharing computation as well, in again, something that can be attached and add-on as opposed to even just within the journal itself.
I totally agree. I mean, I saw the posting. I'm starting to see, and that people draw your attention to stuff like that, and you start paying attention to other folks. So I like the plain language sort of summary, taking an abstract. Somebody did that on the university. They saw one of my publications and asked me to translate it. And actually, that's not an easy thing to do. It's a good exercise. So anyway, I tried anyway. Yeah. I think I brought it to a level where somebody on the outside world might be able to distill something from it. But that's a start.
It's definitely a start. Any other questions or comments for Steven as we wrap up here? All right, let's thank our speaker one more time.
I appreciate it.